So I want to share with you about my first high leverage reading conference, which I would sort of call my go-to zero prep conference. I love this one. I'm going to talk you through the 3 steps, the 3 questions I have in here, and then talk a bit about how I engage with each of these 3 questions with a reader. This go-to reading conference could work really well if you have like a U table in your classroom, a small group table. You could call over like 5 kids with their books and their readers' notebooks, and then kind of work through one by one. So I always start with asking one student to read aloud from the next page in their book. So like I might call up all 5 and say like, hey, like you 4, like just hang out here. I'll be with you in a second. I'll, talk with one reader and say like, will you just read the next page in your book for me? Like I'm having a hard time remembering this part. And then once the student has finished that page, I'll just ask them, hey, what are you thinking about now that you've read this part? And then finally, how does that connect to an earlier part? So these 3 questions actually have tons of different like research and teach opportunities, and I want to get into each of those. Um, Typically, or ideally, I should say, my teaching would follow that last question, but I'll also tell you where I might embed other bits of teaching too. So for that first question, some opportunities you might have are like, when you're asking the student to read aloud from the text, you can actually do tons of things. So here's what I always think about. It's like first and foremost, there's a pretty good odd that the student is reading a book I don't know. So it's a great opportunity for me to assess my students' fluency and then think about that overall fit. You're able to listen to your student. Are they reading it fluently? Does it feel choppy? Do they have nice prosody on the page? How are they chunking? It allows me to think about a lot of that work. This is where the conference can lead right to a teach, which is if the student is struggling to read the page, then I might guide them to another book for now and say, oh, I love this book. Like this book looks fascinating. I want you to put this one to the side. Let's hold this off for a couple of weeks, and I actually want to introduce you to a separate book. This is where, having a couple of books that are like easy to coach into, like, can I have you try starting this book? That could really come in handy. But like I said, having a student read aloud from the next page in their book gives me a great lens into the book itself, especially if it's unfamiliar or it's one I haven't read in a while. I'm able to sort of listen in as a reader and kind of think alongside the student. Um, the nice thing is when you're not asking a student totally cold, they have something to say. So by reading that page to you, it's fresh in their mind and they have something to say right away, which is what I love about having them read aloud from the next page in their book. When it comes to that second question, here's what I often think about. Once I ask, what are you thinking about now that you've read this part? I might be listening. Like if the student doesn't have much to say, and this is more true early in the year. By the time I've done this conference, like, I'm about 100 days into the school year now, like students always have something they can say. But if they don't, then I just redirect their eyes to the page and say, can you just reread this like one more paragraph again in your head? And just as you're reading it, we just think, what's important here? Every single part of a text is written with intentionality. So just getting the kid to key into like even little parts can have something important. Um, and this might be a teaching opportunity here. We're like, I might teach the student, today and going forward, I want you to do what we just did here, which is when I asked you to read a part aloud to me, you didn't have a lot to say. But then when you pause and reread a section, you suddenly had a lot to say. So I want to teach you that, pausing with greater regularity and just saying like, what's important here can make you go from being a good reader to a great reader. And I might give them a few sticky notes and say like, can we just stick these throughout a couple of chapters in your book? And then every time you reach that blue sticky note, you're starting to think like, what's important here? You might even jot it on the top sticky for them. Okay. But if the student has a clear idea of something to talk about, and this is what you're hoping, then I'd proceed to that next question. Okay. So that's where I would then ask, how does that connect to an earlier part? And this is where you're really assessing how is the student engaging with the whole text, not just a single page, but when they're reading a part in the book, can they then say, oh, right, this reminds me of when the character first did this thing? Of course, your student might go, I don't know, I'm not really sure, this feels different or this feels new. Then I might say, great, you're discovering something new, your character's revealing a new side, there's a new piece of the plot unfolding. And I might guide them to like put a sticky note at the end of the next chapter and say like, will you see if there are more connections to this bit of newness that's happening, this new thing you've discovered? And that could be the teaching point there. Today I want to teach that when something new and significant happens in your book, I want you to be ready for it to happen again, or to think about how it might happen in a new way. Like if it happens to the main character, this problem, is there another character who experiences the same type of problem? If the student can find a connection, then I might ask them to take me to that part. right? Or encourage them to jot. And then here's where my conference is ideally going, right? So the student can clearly answer all three of those questions that I've asked them. They can read it fluently. They can say what's happening on the page that they're thinking about and what it connects to and show me that. Then I might teach ahead in the unit. If I'm teaching a fiction reading unit, I might say like, could we think about like how to take or organize your notes to make them more insightful? Or can we think about how characters aren't just one way? Like you're telling me that this character is this way. Can we start thinking about how the character might have other sides? If they're at school, how are they versus at home? How are they? Teach into that character complexity. Or I might even coach them to think about the significance of a secondary or a minor character. Often as readers, fourth graders, third, fourth graders are thinking about the main character in their book. And you want to start keying them into noticing those secondary, those minor characters. And this could be a great opportunity to do that. You didn't mention this character who's on the page. Can you tell me more about them? Can we start thinking more about them? The author puts every character in the book for a reason. Why is this minor or secondary character in there? You could also guide your students start thinking about like making text-based predictions. Like based on what you've read on this page, what do you think might happen next? Or how might the problem start to get resolved in this text, etc. So that is kind of my go-to conference. The beauty, like I said, is it's kind of no prep. You go in with those three questions. You have the student read the page so that you can assess their fluency. You can also start to learn the book if it's one you don't know. And then you ask them, like, what are you thinking about? What significance is the student making of that page? And then thinking about text connection. All right. Each of these different questions can lead to all sorts of different types of teaching too, which is the beauty of it, I like to think.